did not fare well in that location. It was exposed to the intense winds of Lake Michigan. It was in a heavily used area. It was in a low setting with poor sight lines. It not only deteriorated, but the artwork was also the victim of severe vandalism. Fortunately, this sculpture was the gift of the Ferguson Fund of the Art Institute. As Chicagoans, we are so lucky that lumber merchant Benjamin Franklin Ferguson decided to establish a $1 million endowment for the installation and perpetual care of public art in our city more than a century ago. In 2006, the Ferguson Fund, oops, I guess I can hold it. Oh, that works much better. In 2006, the Ferguson Fund covered the cost of removing the artwork, sending the damaged pieces back to Louise Bourgeois so that they could be recreated by the artist who was then in her 90s. The other pieces went into storage. For several years, the project was tangled up in good old political bureaucracy. But then President Traubert asked, why don't we find an alternative location with Chicago's parks so that we can return the artwork to its rightful place in the public sphere? The timing was excellent because the city of Chicago had recently transferred ownership of Chicago Women's Park to the Park District. Until the last several years, the contributions of Chicago women had been largely overlooked. It is wonderful that we have such a place to recognize this important part of our city's history, and it is so fitting that the Jane Addams Memorial is now here. I want to thank President Traubert, and I'm going to introduce you, so you have to wave. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for all you did to make this happen. Thank you very much.
So this has been so much fun and such an honor for me. But we have to thank you, President Traubert, for understanding the value of a relatively small treasure in the grand scheme of things. And as you can imagine, President Traubert has lots to deal with the Chicago Park District is an enormous and complicated agency. I also want to recognize Mike Kelly, the interim general superintendent of the Park District, and Gia Biaggi, the director of planning and development, for their leadership on this project. There were also a large number of fellow staff members at the Park District who helped nurture this project from its initial planning phase to the installation that you see today. I want to recognize Tim Lader. Tim, you can wave. Khadija Hashmi, who really spearheaded quite a bit of this, but she's taking an AutoCAD class, so she couldn't be here today. Dave Richmond, Bill Bernady, Liz O'Callahan, Chris Gent, and Lauren Polinsky, and Elizabeth Garza. We thank you so much because this really was a team effort. I also want to thank Mimi McKay. Okay, now say Mimi. Mimi is the landscape architect who originally designed Chicago Women's Park for the city, and she very graciously helped us identify the location for the installation. Jane Addams was one of the most important figures in the history of Chicago. Eleanor Roosevelt called her a crusader for public welfare and world peace. In 1911, John Higginbotham, a prominent Chicago businessman, said this: formerly, men who held the biggest mortgages were considered the biggest men in town. But now, the biggest man is he who takes the most and best interest in his town. And the biggest man in Chicago is Miss Jane Addams. Senator Paul Douglas said, I can say with due restraint that Miss Jane Addams is the only person of my knowledge who could be properly called a saint. To me, she was the finest character I have ever known. Now, I know you are only expecting to see a memorial to Jane Addams, but I am very honored today that I'm going to introduce you to Jane Addams.
I'm almost speechless with emotion today at this beautiful dedication and your presence with me today. But I'm going to read to you a couple of pages from my recently published memoir, 20 Years at Her House. The winter after I left Rockford Seminary was spent in the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia, but the development of the spinal difficulty which had shadowed me from childhood, forced me into Dr. Mitchell's hospital for the late spring, and the next winter I was literally bound for bed in my sister's house for 6 months. The long illness inevitably put aside the immediate prosecution of a medical course, and although I had passed my examinations credibly enough in the required subjects in the first year, I was very glad to have a physician's sanction for giving up clinics and dissecting rooms and to follow his prescription of spending the next 2 years in Europe. One of the most poignant of my experiences, which occurred during the first few months after our landing upon the other side of the Atlantic, was on a Saturday night when I received an ineradicable impression of the wretchedness of East London and also saw, for the first, the overcrowded quarter of a great city at midnight. A small party of tourists were taken to the East End by a city missionary to witness the Saturday night sale of decaying fruits and vegetables, which, owing to the Sunday laws in London, could not be sold until Monday, and as they were beyond safekeeping, were disposed of at auction as late as possible on Saturday night. On Mile End Road, from the top of an omnibus which paused at the end of a dingy street, lighted only by occasional flares of gas, we saw two huge masses of ill-clad people clamoring around two hucksters' carts. They were bidding their farthings for a vegetable held by the auctioneer, which he at last scornfully flung for its cheapness to the successful bidder. In a momentary pause, only one man detached himself from the groups. He had bidden in a cabbage, and when it struck his hand, he instantly sat down on the curb, tore it with his teeth, and hastily devoured it, unwashed and uncooked as it was. He and his fellows were the type of submerged tenths, as our missionary guide told us with some little satisfaction in the then new phrase, and he further added that so many of them could scarcely be seen in one spot, save at this Saturday night auction, the desire for cheap food being apparently the only thing which could move them simultaneously. They were huddled into ill-fitting, cast-off clothing, the ragged finery which one only sees in East London. Their pale faces were dominated by that most unlovely of human expressions, the cunning and shrewdness of the bargain hunter, who starves if he cannot make a successful trade. And yet, the final impression was not of ragged, tawdry clothing or of pinched and sallow faces, but of myriads of hands, empty, pathetic, nervous and work-worn, showing white in the uncertain light of the street and clutching forward for food which was already unfit to eat. Perhaps nothing is so fraught with significance as the human hand. This oldest tool with which man has dug his way from savagery and with which he is constantly groping forward. I have never since been able to see a number of hands held upward, even when they are moving rhythmically in a calisthenic exercise or when they belong to a class of chubby children who wave them in eager response to a teacher's query, without a certain revival of this memory, a clutching at the heart reminiscent of the despair and resentment which seized me then. For the following weeks, I went about London almost furtively, afraid to look down narrow streets and alleys lest they disclose again this hideous human need and suffering. I carried with me for days at the time that curious surprise we experience when we first come back into the streets after days given over to sorrow and to death. We are bewildered that the world should be going on as usual and unable to determine which is real, the inner pang or the outward seeming. In time, all huge London came to seem unreal, save the poverty in its East End. It was, of course, a most fragmentary and lurid view of London and quite unfair. I should have been shown either more or less, for I went away with no notion of the hundreds of men and women who had gallantly identified their fortunes with these empty-handed people, and who in church and chapel, relief work and charities were at least making an effort toward its mitigation. Thank you.
The dedication of this sculpture is a milestone for this park and creates a place here in this garden for people to connect with the efforts made by Jane Addams through art, and provides an additional emotional connection to her great work.
Today we add another layer to that rich history with the dedication of the Helping Hands sculpture. And it's wonderful for us to have this opportunity to be able to interpret this very important woman in Chicago to the thousands and thousands of people who come down here every year to visit the museums. Jane Addams would have received a lot of support from the society women that lived on Prairie Avenue in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of those women were dedicated to bettering the lives of those less fortunate than themselves, and they obviously turned to Jane Addams as the woman who was most successful at making that happen for thousands and thousands of immigrants coming into our city. Frances Glessner, for example, was a good friend of Jane Addams, and Miss Addams frequently shows up in Mrs. Glessner's journal with various meetings that they would have had, correspondence. And in later years, Mrs. Glessner even took silversmithing classes down at Hull House, experiencing firsthand what it was like for those people to be down there.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited you all came out under the threat of rain, and it seems that it might be realizing itself. So I'll try to keep this informative but brief and do a rain dance to keep the rain away. I'm so excited to be here this morning. I'm a Chicago native, and even though I've been away for about 10 years, I've now come back to this amazing moment to see the rededication of Helping Hands by an artist who was super important to my own education, to the people that taught me, and someone who is really a titan of the art world, of the entire 20th century art world. And so it's exciting to see this art titan now make, or I should say, we should receive this work by this art titan, this sort of dedication to a titan of Chicago's civic life here. Jane Addams, of course, was famous for her civic work and her social amelioration work, and this whole house was a place that she created to bring people together for both succor, for solace, and for education. And Louise Bourgeois did exactly the same thing in New York. She actually had a series of salons in her home in Chelsea that she ran for decades for artists and cultural workers in New York. And I think it's very important as well that Bourgeois, though born in Paris, moved to New York in 1938. She was one of several artists who were really escaping the scourge of Hitler. Thank you so much. It was one of several artists, as I meant, who were leaving Europe and coming to America as immigrants, not just for a sort of glamorous art life that we think of and associate with the avant-garde, but for someone who really came here for safety and for peace. And once again, that is a wonderful and I think very apt tie-in with Jane Addams and what she had done for the city, especially for an immigrant population. I think it's also significant that Louise Bourgeois was born literally 100 years ago. She almost lived to see her 100th birthday, but died just 1 year short of it. And so we're talking about a woman who literally spanned the great 20th century of art making. She was educated at the Sorbonne, finishing her degree in 1933. And then, as I said, came to New York, where she had her first solo show in 1945. So you can imagine someone who really had worked through all the stages of modern and contemporary art. And she was trained as a painter initially, but moved on to sculpture, very much working in the tradition of classic sculptors in the Italian tradition. And you can see that influence here, and the sort of realism and the softness of the hands here with Helping Hands. And she was one of the first women to be honored with a retrospective in most major museums around the world. She had her first in MoMA in 1982, and another one followed in the 90s. She's had 2 major retrospectives at the Tate Museum in London, one at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, another at the Guggenheim in New York, and on and on and on and on and on. I won't give you her entire CV now, but we're talking about someone who's probably wielded the most influence as a woman on art history, especially in modern and in the contemporary world. And I should say her legacy isn't just about the length of her career, but really about what she did with art history. She was one of the artists who really introduced surrealism in sort of an everyday language in art. And I think many of us may know surrealism through someone like Salvador Dali, who had these crazy fantasy images, these kind of dreamlike images. But what's nice about Bourgeois was that her engagement with surrealism wasn't just about fantasy. It wasn't just about the things that were unreal, but it was about thinking about the inner life, about your feelings. And a lot of her work was expressed some dark things. They were about anxiety. It was about fear. I mean, some of her works were nightmarish, and they were large, and they had some spiders in them and so forth. But a lot of her work, too, were about warm feelings, about love, and about caring, and about sharing. And Helping Hands really is a great example of that. I think it's wonderful that for this work, she didn't choose to make a monument that was a large-scale sculpture. It wasn't the sort of real figuration of Jane Addams, a picture of her, as you would normally see. But it was about these hands that Jane, thank you so much, very beautifully spoke about as a symbol. And all these hands, as you can see, are sort of reaching out and touching. And they're so delicate and so warm. And so for Bourgeois, this idea of surrealism was about the inner life of what you could love and what you feel inside. And so I'm so very excited to see Helping Hands here in the park, in the Women's Park, and a great work by a woman dedicated to a very great woman of Chicago. Thank you.